I love the gavel. It's 5:03. This is a workshop of the Board of Trustees of Belton Independent School District. Today it is whatever the date is, and the time is 5:03. I just love how I changed this up on y'all. So anywho, I'd like to call this meeting to order. A quorum of board members is present. And this meeting has been duly called, and a notice of the meeting has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. We are going to open our workshop, and I'll just turn this over to Dr. Smith. Well, actually, we'll start with public comments. Do we have anyone signed up, Connie? No public comments, so we'll just move right on into the board workshop. Dr. Smith.
Wonderful. Madam There we go. I remembered to turn it on this time. Madam President, members of the board, thank you for being here tonight. A couple of quick housekeeping items as we open up this workshop. Again, we are all still masked up if we are not 6 feet away from each other. But if we are more than 6 feet away from each other, we do understand the need and the ability for people to take masks off. So we appreciate our public and their understanding, and we'll make the same announcement when our public comes in for the regular board meeting. Tonight's workshop, we are welcoming Holly Wardell, our legal counsel, through Eichelbaum Wardell and Associates, and she's going to take us through a workshop. The topic for tonight is mainly around census and redistricting. This is obviously a new process for me as a brand new superintendent, and I believe it's probably a new process for many of you as board members for the first time in Belton ISD. We go through a redistricting process every 10 years, and I'm going to turn it over to Holly to help us work through some of the learning we need to do for this.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Good evening, Madam President, members of the board, Dr. Smith. I am happy to be here this evening to talk to you about, can you hear me okay with the mask on? Okay. So, maybe.
Can we just check and make sure Holly's microphone is on? Okay, perfect.
All the way up? Okay. Very good. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here this evening to talk to you, to give you a very, very basic introduction to the 2020 census and the effect that it will have on redistricting. It'll be time to think about that. It's kind of interesting, the census is taken every 10 years, and I will, as of next month, be starting my 25th year of representing school districts and boards around the state of Texas, but this will actually be my third census. So that's an interesting logic problem if you want to do the math on that. But it's something that only happens every 10 years, and so you can do a big data dump after you do the redistricting. You have to kind of learn this stuff every 10 years. But basically, what we are going to be talking about tonight is to start thinking about your redistricting process, primarily which is going to, if my calculations are correct, occur in early 2022. So let me kind of walk you through how this works. For school districts that have single member districts, which of course you have 5, and you have 2 at-large placements for the board, you'll have to start planning for considering the census data that comes out next year and figuring out whether you have to redistrict your areas or your places. And so the way that it works is that once the data comes out, and that's required to come out by April 1st, 2021, then you'll have to take that data, and you've already got a contract in place with an expert and a consultant for redistricting, and I'll show you some information about him at the end of the presentation. But they'll take that data and look at where the population is, whether it's changed significantly within your school district, and whether those districts or those areas need to be redrawn. And what you're looking for are whether or not your districts are imbalanced by a certain percentage, which is reflected in your legal policy, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the danger of holding elections with imbalanced districts is that you are vulnerable to discrimination lawsuits, basically, under this one person, one vote principle established by the U.S. Constitution. And the one person, one vote principle is this principle that all citizens, regardless of where they live in your school district, are entitled to equal legislative representation, or as equal as possible. so that their vote counts as much as somebody in another district. And this principle was enunciated in a 1964 U.S. Supreme Court case called Reynolds versus Sims. And so I've got a couple of Supreme Court cases here that we'll talk about. One of them is a very important one that recently, 2013, struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A lot of you, if you've been on the board for any length of time prior to 2013, you'll recall that any time a school district wanted to change anything with regard to their elections, they wanted to change from having it having it at the church to a campus or vice versa. Every single change that occurred with respect to an election had to receive pre-clearance from the U.S. Department of Justice. And so I worked for many, many years with an attorney who kind of specialized in this, and she wrote thousands of pre-clearance submissions to the Department of Justice. And usually if you got those in on time, those were approved. But everything had to be approved through the Department of Justice within a certain amount of time, even if you were just changing a polling location. Or when we had to add machines that were accessible under the Americans with Disabilities Act, even though that was required by law, all of those changes had to be pre-approved by the Department of Justice. So historically, this Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required pre-clearance, but in 2013, in this case called Shelby versus Holder, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that Section 5 was unconstitutional. And this case actually involved Shelby County, Alabama, versus Eric Holder, when Eric Holder was the Attorney General, and they sued, claiming that they shouldn't have to get pre-clearance anymore because the requirement under the Voting Rights Act to seek pre-clearance was based on data and circumstances that existed in 1965. So the data and information in the process was 40 years old, and the Supreme Court ultimately found that, in a 5-4 decision, that those conditions no longer existed. And so there was no longer a need for there to be, on a nationwide basis, pre-clearance for any change in elections. So since 2013, it's been a lot easier to make changes with regard to redistricting or any kind of change with regard to your election. So information in there, and on most of these cases, mostly for Mr. Alcoser's benefit, I listed who the Chief Justice or who the author of the opinion was, because in case he wanted to geek out and go pull those up and read that, or just keeping score at home. And this decision was written by Chief Justice Roberts. Interesting decision. Even though the Supreme Court ruled that pre-clearance is no longer required, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination against certain protected voting groups, remains in place. So you still have to have balanced districts and districts that allow for people in minority voting groups to have adequate or equal protection under the law. So there's this concept of protected voter groups, and under Section 2, those are individuals who are in minority voting groups, and that means race, color, or an individual that has a membership in a language minority group is the language that they use. And so those individuals are still protected, and we still have criteria from another U.S. Supreme Court case called Shaw versus Reno. It started out as Shaw versus Reno, ended up being Shaw versus Hunt, that prohibits race-based redistricting. So again, kind of as some factual background for you, there was this other case that went to the Supreme Court before Shelby versus Holder called Shaw versus Reno. And in this case, you can see this started in 1993, or it was 1993 by the time it got up to the U.S. Supreme Court for the first time, and this was after the 1990 census. And what happened in that particular case was 5 citizens from North Carolina sued, and basically, and what happened is the U.S. Attorney General had rejected their congressional reapportionment plan because it created only one black majority district within the entire state of North Carolina. And then they submitted a new one that had 2 districts that were black minority districts, black majority districts, and that was again rejected by Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General at the time. That second district was so small that it was no wider than the interstate road along which it stretched. So at one part of the district, it was very, very narrow. It was only the length of an interstate, or the width of an interstate. And so this went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in this particular case, Justice O'Connor issued, again, I think another 5-4 decision that said that the individuals who were suing to say that those districts were discriminatory or illegal had actually stated a claim. Didn't actually say that they won, but said that they stated a claim because the case had been dismissed at the lower level, and so it was remanded to go back to the trial court to decide whether or not the district was gerrymandered, basically. And so if you're interested like I am, I'm always interested in knowing how the story ends. This actually worked its way back up to the U.S. Supreme Court 3 years later, 1996. We get a decision from Chief Justice Rehnquist, and Shaw versus Hunt is what it's styled as at this point, that basically said, yes, all of these individuals who lived in the district, they did have standing to bring this lawsuit, and the district's plan was gerrymandered, basically, that it was not narrowly tailored enough to serve a compelling state interest, and it violated the Equal Protection Clause. So, you know, that's kind of the danger of having imbalanced districts, is you have a lawsuit that could potentially go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So what happens when we get the data is going to reflect, or it's supposed to reflect, the total population in the United States as of April 2nd, 2020, so a couple of months ago. You know, they're still collecting that data. You may have seen that there was an injunction, and then the Supreme Court last week said, no, you can go ahead and stop collecting data on the census. And you know, there's concerns about whether, especially because of COVID, whether it will, you know, be accurate data. But the U.S. Census Department can now stop collecting data, and because there's certain things that they have to do with this data, and they have timelines in order to respond to do that. So, at any rate, once they're going to take all the data that they have to date, and whatever they continue to get in the future, if anything, if they want, and they're going to put together what's referred to as a 94-171 file. So ultimately, all of the states and governmental entities will get information in one of these 94-171 files. And this is where your expert, your consultant, will come into play to help you really analyze this data. But this is going to include the total population for the school district, and then it will break down the voting age population by sex, race, ethnicity, and voting age. And then they also break it down into something called a census block level. And I'm not entirely sure when you get to that point what all is involved in that, but there are things called census blocks, and then group blocks, and census tract datas. But what I can tell you is that what they try to do is get data down to the city block basis, to get it that specific, you know, to help you look at your population for redistricting purposes. And this is where your expert, your consultant, will come into play to help you decide how to redistrict, or whether you need to redistrict at all. But if there's been any growth in a district, like there has been here, you can probably reasonably expect that there will be at least some reapportionment of the areas to match up with your population. All right, let's see. So it's required by law, this 94-171 file, to be released by April 1st of next year. And so for districts and cities and counties that have elections in November, they're going to have to act very quickly. Now, your elections are in May, right? So your elections are in May, so you're not going to have to really worry about this until May of the following year. But basically, when this data comes out for those entities that have elections in November, they're basically going to have 100 days to figure all of this out and decide how they want to redistrict in time to get that done before the November general election date. So you're sitting in a good position to have a little bit more time to make a more measured, you know, decision about these types of things. So historically, districts used this information from the 94-171 file to redistrict. I mean, they used that as the census data to make these redistricting decisions. But there's been a movement within the last decade or so for governmental entities to use this other method called the citizen voting age population process. And again, if you're interested in that, we can get your consultant to explain that. But basically, rather than looking at the total population, they're looking at the total number of individuals in that area who can vote. They're citizens who can vote. So it doesn't include the entire population, if that makes sense. And so this has been challenged, and it's gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you don't have to use this CVAP or CVAP method, and kind of left an open question as to whether cities and counties and school districts could, but I think that's a viable option. If anybody's really interested in that, then we can have our consultant look into that. But that's where that citizenship question on the census and the dispute over that really became interesting. You remember the current administration wanted to have a citizenship question on the census. That was challenged by various states and cities, and went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't ask that question. And of course, the concern was that it would have a chilling effect on the number of people who responded if they had to respond whether or not they were a citizen, because they would be afraid that that information would be used later against them to come deport them. For what it's worth, the current administration has said we're still going to issue information about citizenship status for entities that want to use this CVAP process, and they're going to pull information about individuals' citizenship status from other records. I'm not sure which records, but other records, and try to provide that to cities and counties and school districts that would like to use that. And if you really want to geek out and figure out how they're doing that, I found that this was posted about a month ago by one of the senior mathematicians at the U.S. Census about how they're going to estimate, citizenship status in small areas. So lots of fun information out there if you're so inclined to go do all that kind of research. So the timing of redistricting, as I mentioned, for those cities and counties that have elections in November, they're going to have a shorter timeline. You'll have more time to figure that out. But I also wanted to make you aware of some of the state law requirements, because that's really where the rubber hits the road with respect to what Belton ISD will need to be looking at within the next year and a half. And boundary changes, any boundary changes under the Texas Education Code have to be approved at least 3 months before the election date, preferably before the filing date, so that you know where your boundaries are going to be drawn, so you can have people who are from those areas, from those districts. But at least 3 months prior to the election date, you have to make those decisions and announce that and provide notice. All of these requirements are laid out in your BBB legal policy, and there's some great information in here, so I wanted to kind of walk you through this. That basically, unless a school district is subject to a continuing desegregation order, then you'll follow the requirements in the Education Code. And to my knowledge, Belton's not subject to a desegregation order. Anybody? Because I looked, I didn't find them on any of the lists. So basically, these are the rules by which that you play by. First of all, membership. The board consists of the number of members that it had as of 1995. So you had 7, you'll continue to have 7. If you have a smaller board, and there are a few places that do that, they can increase it, but you're not in a position to be able to decrease that. Nor can you pack the board, like you pack the court, by adding more. But basically in Texas, you're going to be a 7-member district. It's possible to go to a 9 trustee board as well for districts of a certain size, but we're not going to have to worry about that. Now, your terms have to be either for 3 or 4 years, as you all know. I think everybody here has a 3-year term under your local policy. Oops, I think I skipped one there. And as you know, your elections have to be on uniform election dates. That was something that they changed in the law that has occurred certainly during my career. And then also, there was a change some years ago that said we have to hold joint elections to be efficient with our state resources, state and local resources, to have our elections with cities and counties. And so that was a big change a number of years ago. Again, one of those changes that even though our state law required it, and we had to seek pre-clearance from the Department of Justice. So under state law, you can have at-large positions, and you can have single-member districts. But under state law, let's see if I have this highlighted here. I don't. You have to have at least 70% of your members from single-member districts, which is what you have. You have 2 at-large positions, and then you have 5 areas or 5 districts or 5 places. And the board can approve that on their own motion. You've done that many years ago. This is currently what you have. If you ever want to go back and look at the terms and for the various areas or various districts, it's in your BBB local policy. So here is your current schedule for elections. You've got your 2 at-large positions. They're going to be up 2020, 23, 26, areas 2 and 4, and 2021, 2024, and areas 1, 3, and 5 up in 22 and 25. So it's going to be areas 1, 3, and 5. They're going to be primarily impacted, I think, by, well, all of the districts will be, areas will be impacted by the redistricting, but especially for that election in 2022. Now, this is where it gets interesting in my opinion. In terms of criteria, if you do research, you'll find various criteria for redistricting. Under the Education Code, we have some specific ones that school boards must consider. Your areas or your districts or your places are supposed to be compact, contiguous, and as nearly equal in population as possible. So that's basically what you're going to use that census data for, is to try to figure out how many people per district, and they're supposed to, even your district may be kind of differently shaped, but they're supposed to have as many, or as equal, be as equal as possible in terms of the population. And whether you consider that total population or just the citizens of voting age population, that'll be a decision that you'll make with our expert. Now, trustees, these districts have to be drawn, as I mentioned, 90 days before the first election under the new districts. So you have to announce it 90 days. And the number of terms, you get to, well, you can decide again or kind of redo if you want to change the number of terms from 3 years to 4 years. And you also kind of draw at that point as to which place comes up next. And so this is one of the questions that I would have for our consultant as to whether or not you can just keep the current schedule or whether you really have to draw lots for staggered terms at that point. In other words, if somebody just ran for re-election the year before and they draw, does that mean that they're up again next year? And I just don't know the answer to that question, but we'll find out for you. So that'll be something that we'll work through with them. But basically what the Education Code says is that the trustees then elected after redistricting shall draw lots for staggered terms. So it implies that you draw again, that maybe you're not safe for a 3-year term under your existing schedule. That might change. So there's a possibility that might happen. And basically, when I show you at the end some information about the expert that you've already got a contract with, you'll see that you're going to be in very good hands, very, very experienced individual. And so anything that I say, I should give a disclaimer right now, that he comes along later and says otherwise, we're going to go with what he says, because he's certainly an expert in this area, and this is what he does. So in your BBB legal policy, you've got an entire subsection called redistricting. It basically just says 90 days before the first regular board election at which trustees may officially recognize and act on the last census data. So in your case, you won't have 90 days before the May 2021 election, so that's going to put you to May 2022. Does that make sense? Okay. So that'll be your first regular board election at which you had time to act on the preceding federal census. A board shall redivide a district into the appropriate number of districts and try to make the population, you have to redistrict. Basically what this is saying is if the largest district and the smallest district by population, if there's a more than 10% difference. And so they want them, they don't all have to be exactly the same, but you can't have more than a 10% difference in your biggest district and your smallest area. And so that'll be the interesting part to work out.
Holly, can I jump in real quick?
Certainly.
Boy, that seems very loud. So one of the things in this discussion that we wanted to have, board members, please feel free to ask questions along the way, but because of the growth of Belton ISD in the past 10 years, we wanted to get you this information as soon as possible in the fall. When we get the data in the spring, we've already been in discussion with the consultant. We would like to begin the discussions in the spring because Belton ISD might be a little trickier than some other districts based on the growth that you all have seen, particularly in certain areas of the district. And so this might be a little more complex problem than you had a decade ago, hence the reason we're bringing this to you right now. But most likely when Holly's talking about that 10% variance and stuff, most likely we have seen a large population growth in the north part of our district in the past 10 years and also down there in the south part of our district. And so how that plays out with those areas in between is going to be very interesting for us and something that we're going to have to really dive into.
So yeah, it will be an interesting process. There's also this option in the education code, and it's interesting that the election, the redistricting information is not necessarily in the election code, but for school districts in the education code. You'll find that, again, in your BBB legal policy. But the board could adopt a redistricting plan, according to the education code, that allows trustees to serve out the remainder of their term. And so this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about when you draw lots as to staggered terms, you can adopt a plan that says, but you still get to finish out the remainder of your term. And so this is where our consultant or expert will help us in terms of figuring out what that actually looks like. So you've got your 2 at-large areas, you've got your 2 at-large positions and your 5 areas or places. Oh, that's a duplicate slide, I apologize for that. And I also wanted to mention in your local policy, the school board decided some years ago that both positions, the at-large positions and the area positions would be elected by plurality, but I wanted to, which basically means they receive more votes than the other candidates. But you do have some other options, not that I'm necessarily recommending any of these, but I wanted you to know what your options were. For at-large positions, you could require a majority vote, and there's a special requirement for that, I'll show you in just a minute, where a candidate would have to have a majority, at least 51% of the votes in order to be elected. That's one option. Plurality is easier. In case you have 2 or 3, then whoever gets the most votes is the winner. Or for, again, at-large positions, you can have cumulative voting. So say, for example, you have 3 candidates running for a particular at-large position, then every voter gets to cast 3 votes, and they could cast all 3 for one person. So they get to cast as many votes as there are positions. And so that's the concept of cumulative voting. And I don't know many districts that do that, but it's an interesting concept nonetheless. And then for areas, though, you don't have the option of cumulative voting. It's either majority or plurality. And if you want to change to a majority vote, you have to go through this process in the education code where you tell people 6 months ahead of time that you're going to change to a majority vote from plurality vote. So in case you're keeping track at school and coming up with a calendar there, if you want to do that, you're going to have to do that even 3 months before you decide on the redistricting issue. So some other requirements with respect to your boundary changes. Of course, you're going to have to notify the voter registrar for the county. They've got to start making decisions with regard to elections and working on that as well. And you get your map to the registrar's office, but again, that's what your expert will help you do all of that. And it's kind of interesting, if you Google, there is still voting rights litigation that goes on, even in non-political years or non-census years. There's one lawsuit that Richardson ISD has been dealing with for the last couple of years, and they had an all-white board, and they were sued by some individuals, and they have, through the process of that litigation, ultimately settled that litigation and have agreed to go to single-member districts. I think they were completely at large or didn't have many single-member seats on their board. So it's interesting if you look out there that there is still this type of a risk for litigation depending on your community and your circumstances. There are various criteria that cities and counties and school districts use for determining how they're going to reapportion or realign or redistrict. These are some from one of the national organizations for states and some of the criteria that they look at. Again, I defer to your expert who will help you on the considerations that Belton ISD should take into consideration. But one of the traditional criteria that I've seen repeatedly is trying to preserve core prior districts or areas where you can, so that you don't completely disenfranchise voters. They don't know what district they're in anymore, area. They don't know where to go to vote, and all of those types of things. And this is the individual you'll be working with, Professor Morrison, who is a professor at Baylor, who has worked extensively in this area and really specializes in redistricting. And so, again, when he comes and says, yeah, what that lady told you was wrong, then we're going to go with what he has to say, because he's our expert on that. And if you also are very studious and want to study up on this, the state of Texas has a website for how they are going to, for state offices, engage in this redistricting process. And I've provided that link up there to you. Okay. Oh, we've got the policies there as well that we've kind of walked through. So I appreciate that, Connie. Thank you. And but basically, we just wanted to present this information to get it on your radar. Just a very, again, basic introduction for redistricting because it is something that you'll be dealing with. And so you're kind of way ahead of the game at this point to start thinking about it and start working on this sometime next year, especially after you get the data and hopefully come to some equitable solution. Yeah.
So before we jump into any of the other stuff, or questions from board members, thoughts, any comments from y'all from your perspective on this?
So I actually got to participate in the redistricting the last time, and it is a truly fascinating process. And it was Area 2 and Area 4 where we had to redo the boundaries a little bit because of the growth. But it's a great way to learn more about the community again, and the conversations that we had and the education that we received as a part of making those decisions. It's a fun process, actually. It's fascinating. So I think this will be great for our district.
Rosie, what were the issues with that 2 and 4? What?
There had been more growth. So Area 2 has a lot of land and not as much, well, in the past, the neighborhoods have been smaller. That's a little bit different now. And so there was an imbalance. There was more than a 10% discrepancy in the changes between Area 2 and 4. And it all happened back there right behind First Baptist Belton. There was some growth that was out, that went out that way. So we, similar to when we're districting for our for school attendance boundaries, they simply they looked at the different streets and what was going to make it the easiest for voters to be able to stay in their district and not divide, like one half of a street down the middle. But people were very willing to participate on the committee, and people were willing to have good conversation. So it was nice.
Can I ask Holly a question? Holly, I know we're going to get into this a lot more next year, but it sounds like the analysis starts with the census, and then you kind of work your way forward from there, right?
Correct.
Now, the census, as I listen to you, they look at a lot of different factors, age, race,
Right.
all those kinds of things. So
Ethnicity, sex, right.
when you start redistricting for a school district, are you just mainly looking at numbers of voters in that particular region, or do those other factors that the census looks at, does that come into play?
Well, race and ethnicity definitely come into place because of the Voting Rights Act. So those are factors that you'll need to take into consideration. And exactly how you do that, I don't know, but that's what we have our consultant, to help us with. But yeah, it's not just purely numbers. I think it's numbers plus.
And then you said something about the Texas law, the boundary changes are approved by whom? The feds?
Oh, they're actually, they're not approved by anybody anymore. They had to be approved by the Department of Justice previously because as a matter of pre-clearance under Section 5. But my understanding now is that they don't have to be approved by anybody. It's just you want to make sure that you do it in a manner that's not ultimately discriminatory, even though you don't intend for it to be, that it doesn't, have that disparate impact as well, because the concern is a discrimination lawsuit or basically a voting rights lawsuit. So at this point, it's not that you have to pass muster with any, the Secretary of State's office or the U.S. Department of Justice. It's just that you want to make sure that you have a fair process so that, one person, one vote, counts as something, and you're not vulnerable to a discrimination lawsuit.
So as a practical matter, school districts could do lots of things and not ever have to worry about passing federal or state muster, because unless you're under the gun, you're being watched because you're in a redistricting litigation. You can pretty much, you're taking a risk, of course, right? So without having that approval anymore, it kind of opens things up a lot, doesn't it?
Right. But I know what I could say is that you don't have to get pre-clearance. I think it's still possible that there could be a complaint lodged or certainly a lawsuit under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, and color and language, minority groups. And so I'm not sure what their process is for handling those complaints.
What do you see the most prevalent in terms of litigation over the years that you've been doing this? What are the most common issues that you see?
Just race claims. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We'll try it one more time. Awesome. Does the board have any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Taggart.
Does the district have the option of having all 7 seats be at large? Where is it said that it has to be the 70%? Is that state, national? Is that the BBB local that they adopted here locally? Where does that come from?
Great question. It's in the education code. So it's in the legal policy because it's a legal requirement from the education code, but it's a state requirement.
Okay, so a district doesn't have the option to put all at large. It has to meet that criteria of that 70% being in single.
That's my understanding. That's
Okay.
my reading of it. Again, if Professor Morrison comes along and tells us otherwise, then we'll look at that.
And I will add real quickly on this one. I spent about an hour on the phone with Professor Morrison, and his intent is to, as soon as we get the file of data, to be able to outline with our board what the schedule will be for board presentations. Good news is this will be his third time working with Belton ISD in redistricting, so he's familiar with the area. Bad news is he confirmed just what I told you a little bit earlier, that we've had a lot of growth, so it's going to be an interesting process over the next few months here when we get into it. And I also wanted to say, last thing real quickly, is one of the reasons we brought this to you is after we get past this election season, one of the things that you'll start hearing throughout the state, Holly mentioned the state, as soon as our next legislative session opens up, this is going to be a hot topic around the state because everybody, not just school boards, has to go through a redistricting process. So this is meant to provide you a foundation of information prior to this becoming a hot topic in our area and in our state.
Man, that was Professor Morrison, is that right? Now, is he gonna compile, look at all the reports and then come to us with a proposal? Is that the process?
Yes, sir. He'll come, I can guarantee you he's going to come with some ideas already, and he'll probably put some things out there. His comment to me was he's seen it go great in the past and not great in the past, not referencing Belton ISD, but that the best way to go about it is usually to look at the numbers and provide some proposals and then get the Board of Trustees' feelings from there on it. And after my discussion with him, I feel very confident in he knows what he's talking about. He's apparently done this throughout the state for not only school boards, but for our state elected officials as well.
Can I just add, he was super methodical last time, so you didn't feel like you were making a decision that you were unsure about. He walked you through each step, so you felt very informed. It was nice.
Thank you. Does the board have any other questions, comments? Well, thank you for putting this on our radar. We're excited to get started.
It'll be fun. It'll be
Awesome.
fun. Very good. I think the other topic we had on was looking ahead in school law. I've been so busy, I haven't looked past this Wednesday, but we know redistricting and some other issues. But if you have any other questions, happy to entertain those. Or
Don't see any at this time. So we are moving forward. We're looking ahead in school law.
This was as mentioned previously, this was an open discussion for any of you as board members, any questions that you have or anything that Holly wanted to bring to you all, other school law items coming up. So anything that you all have for questions for Holly, this is a perfect opportunity to have that.
I can tell you the things that are on my radar. Certainly, redistricting will be a big one, as Dr. Smith said, during the next legislative session. Also, legislatively, school, not so much school finance as just, the state's finances due to the downturn in the economy from COVID. That will be a huge issue. We've already started hearing rumors about having to, cut costs, cut budgets and things like that. So that may be a very tough discussion that boards will have to have next year when they're adopting their budgets. And so we've got that. We've got some new Title IX regulations that went into place. Title IX is the federal statute that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. It's been a hot topic, and regulations that went into effect in August for that. I don't see a whole lot changing with respect to generally teacher contracts, Chapter 21 of the Education Code. I haven't heard much about that. And student safety and discipline is always a interesting topic as well. So I think it's pretty much going to be business as usual with respect to other types of school litigation, but those things certainly stick out in my mind as issues that we'll be dealing with a lot within the next year.
Okay. I don't think we have any takers at the moment for any questions.
All right.
So I appreciate you being here and helping us through all of that. Did you have a question, Daniel? No? Okay.
Well, thank you.
I
Thank you
think
for
we're
your
all
time and
good.
attention.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate
My
you
pleasure.
being here. Well, that looks like that's all we had as far as the workshop is concerned. Before we can adjourn, I will tell you that we won't come back till 6:15 for our regular board meeting. So if you need to take a break, now is that time. But at this point, it is 5:46 and we stand adjourned from our workshop.